Howdy everyone! Today we're painting up Lilith from Monster Fight Club's new Borderlands Kickstarter. Thanks to them for supplying a sneak preview of the mini. And we're going to get started on it similar to some of the other figures in this Borderlands painting series with a white primer coat and all over Nuln Oil Gloss coat to get started. What this Nuln Oil Gloss coat does over a white undercoat is it gives you kind of some of the black lining in between color areas to start with. And then as we're going to largely be using contrast paints to finish it off, those black lines in between the areas will show through the contrast and you'll get a nice separation of colors in between the two areas. A quick coat of black on the base will kick things off and we'll finish that later in the video. So with the Nuln Oil Gloss dry on the white undercoat, we're going to come back in and with a little bit of white paint on a crappy old brush, we're just going to lightly brush some white down over the surface of the model. This isn't exactly dry brushing, as you can see here. I'm putting a decent amount of white paint on the model, but I'm also brushing lightly over the surface just to kind of hit the raised areas with some white. That'll brighten up those raised areas like the top of her head and her shoulder pads and prepare you for the contrast paint that is to come. So first contrast paint up is going to be the Citadel Contrast Guilliman Flesh. Now this is a relatively thin transparent paint that shows a lot of the underlayer through it. One coat of this is a pretty solid start to a light kind of Caucasian skin tone. And you can already see as I'm putting it on her face and her neck and chest area here, you can kind of use the black lines that you got in the previous step to kind of guide where to put the contrast paint. If the contrast paint overlaps the black lines a little bit, that's okay. It's transparent enough that the black is going to still look black. You know, if you were doing this with an opaque paint, an opaque flesh tone would cover the black lines that you created with your Nuln Oil Gloss, but the contrast paint lets that black show through. It is important to use the gloss version of Nuln Oil. It flows into the cracks a lot better than the standard version. If you only have the standard version, that's okay. It might mean you're going to need to be a little bit more careful with adding the white in the second step, but I really prefer the gloss version for doing this style of painting. So you're just using a small brush. With this technique, you're not letting the contrast paint pool up. It's not one thick coat. It really is a thin coat. You can see I'm using a thin brush. It's not loaded up with paint. The contrast paint is not pooling up on the miniature. I'm counting on the black lines that we put on there previously and the white highlights that are underneath to create some of the highlight and shading underneath the contrast paint. So you're not letting puddles of contrast paint do your shading for you, which is a little different than how you might be used to using contrast paint. I usually work on a piece of palette paper. I might mention that in a review. I really like that as a product, and it lets you just kind of be a little free and loose with the paint. The paint doesn't soak into that white paper that I have below me. And working on one miniature at a time means that you always have your color that you used previously ready in front of you. Wet palettes are great. I use those in some projects. But I like having a little bit of white from the previous step available. What I'm going to go do is grab a little bit of the white here and put another white highlight on her bridge of her nose, on her chin, on her cheeks, and brighten up the face a little bit more. That'll make her face be, relative to the rest of her skin that's showing, a little bit lighter. And we'll go back in a future step and darken that back down again. So next up, we're going to start with a little bit of the Citadel Snakebite Leather contrast paint, which is kind of a yellowy brown. I think that's a good match for Lilith's leather jacket and some of her clothes. We're mixing that. It's a pretty strong color. The contrast paints have very different strengths. The Snakebite Leather goes on pretty dark straight out of the bottle, so I'm mixing it with a little bit of the Citadel contrast medium. And I've talked to some friends who are a little reluctant to pick up a bottle of the contrast medium because, it's the same price as all the other contrast paints, and it doesn't have any paint in it. It's just a clear bottle of nothing, kind of. And you can definitely use water to thin down your contrast paints. That's fine, and it works okay. I do think that the viscosity of the contrast medium is, as designed, a good match for the contrast paints. And one bottle goes a long way. I mean, I've been painting with contrast paints since they came out, and I've gone through a few bottles of the contrast medium, but I think the difference is worth it. And compared to using water, diluting the paints with the contrast medium, it lets them stick a little bit more. I feel like it gives it a little bit more surface adhesion that's useful when painting minis. So here I messed up a little bit, and that's okay. So what I did is I kind of thought that her arm was going to be covered in leather, but then when I checked a reference picture, I realized that her left arm is actually bare. So I almost just painted it with snakebite leather as if it was covered in her leather jacket, but I realized that it's actually ought to be skin. So we'll go back in and put a little more skin tone on that later. One of the misconceptions about contrast paint, driven by some of the marketing when it was released, is that you just slop it on. And that's really not the case. I think that my favorite way to use contrast paints is actually with a fairly careful, thin application of the contrast paint over a well-prepared, contrasty base layer. It takes a little bit more time, but especially on a game like Borderlands, when you're painting characters, I think it's worth taking that time to prep the surface well, and you'll get a better result with the contrast paint and a more controllable result. If you really are slopping the contrast paint on, it works okay on heavily textured areas like hair or fur, but I find often you end up with kind of puddles and pools of contrast paint that are a little less appealing. So next up, we've got some Basilicanum gray, again from the contrast range. Now, it says gray on the bottle, and you might be tempted to use this for gray things, and you certainly can use it for gray things. Straight out of the bottle, I would call this Basilicanum black. It is very dark. Straight out of the bottle, I think it works great to paint black leathers, faded, black armor. I use this a lot on my Black Templars. I think it's a great color. It's actually one of my favorite contrast paints, but it's really such a dark gray out of the bottle that you're going to get something that's more akin to black. So you can see on the palette there, I've lightened that up a fair amount with contrast medium. It's probably in the neighborhood of 50-50. Contrast paint plus contrast medium. And when it's applied over some of her straps and boots and stuff like that here, I actually think it has a pretty good effect to create like a faded black leathers, faded black knee pads, shoulder pads. So I'm gonna go back in and paint in all her webbing in that dark gray. There is a black paint in the contrast range that's even darker still than the Basilicanum gray. That's Black Templar black. But it's so dark, you really have to water that down if you're going for any sort of gray. Otherwise, it's practically just black paint with just some very subtle contrast effects. It's a little bit of a cooler color. It's got a little bit more blue in it if you're using the Black Templar contrast. And I thought the dark gray would be a better fit for the overall naturalistic colors in the dusty, dirty Borderlands world. Going back in a little bit darker here, less contrast medium, more paint to go for more of a black effect on her boots. And the thing is with contrast paint on your palette and the contrast medium nearby, you can create quite a range of colors just from one pot of paint. That Basilicanum gray could paint anything from a pretty dark black effect on your minis up to a very light gray. I'll often use that diluted with a lot of medium to shade a white area of a miniature. Cygor Brown is up next. This might be my desert island contrast paint. It is just an incredibly versatile color that works well for faded leathers when mixed with a little bit of contrast medium like we're doing here. It also is a really great starting point for darker skin tones. You do a couple of coats of this will really give you a good looking darker skin tone. You can lighten it up and it can be a regular, a lighter skin tone. You can use it straight out of the bottle for a really nice dark brown. And just super versatile. One of the other reasons I like starting with a diluted layer of contrast paint, like this brown, look at her legs there. They're fairly light brown. But when you start with a dilute level of contrast paint, you can then kind of self-shade with more of the same contrast paint, and you know that the shade is going to match. So you start with a diluted layer of Cygor brown and contrast medium, cool. And then once that dries, you can go back in and add a little bit more of the same mixture, layering thin thin down contrast paint over thin down contrast paint. And that's a quick and easy way to get some natural shading without having to mix colors. It's relatively quick and easy. So that's another reason to kind of keep your paint in front of you. And the contrast paint dries fast enough that you can do that, often in the same sitting. The thin layer of paint that you're putting on your miniature, it's going to dry much faster than the puddle of paint that's on your palette. So you can often let it dry and do a second coat without ever coming back or pouring out more paint. The Vulpus pink, that's not a contrast paint I use very often, but it's a great color. I've kind of been looking for an excuse to use this on more miniatures. This is straight out of the bottle, not diluted. This is one of the less strong contrast paints. You can see on Lilith's hair, there's still some strong highlights visible through a straight out of the bottle layer of Vulpus pink. And you can see if you look closely there, I got a little spot of pink on her fur collar, but that's no problem. We'll just touch that up with a little bit of white later, and then before we put any paint on her collar. So yeah, that's a really nice, vibrant shaded pink. I think that also could look good on some miniatures' lips or for other accent colors. So again, with the idea of keeping your paints in front of you, I kind of decided at this point that I wanted to add a little bit more visual interest on her, kind of around her face, and change the color of the shoulder pads to black. And, you know, there's no right or wrong way to do things. When you're painting, you can change your mind. You can always paint over something. The advantage of doing thin coats of paint is that you're not going to build up too much paint on the miniature. We're getting into painting her shirt here with a quick skim of Militarum green over those areas. If you've noticed, I'm kind of bouncing around the miniature a little bit. You know, we went from skin first, and then jacket, and then black parts, and then pants. With contrast paints, it's sometimes nice to do areas that aren't touching each other. That makes it less likely that the contrast paints are going to mix together on the miniature. Now, if you caught what I just did on her belly there, I painted the whole shirt in a layer of Militarum gray, let that quickly dry because it was such a thin coat, and then I went back in with a little more and very quickly did a second coat of Militarum green on her stomach, darkening that up a little bit. Here's that arm I missed earlier. Don't sweat mistakes too much when painting. You can always go back in and redo something. As long as you know what you wanted to do, it's not that big a deal to fix it up the second time. So, yeah, that arm is now fleshy, and it's also a good opportunity to go in and just dab a little bit of flesh tones into like the recessed part of her neck underneath her arm, darken it up a little bit. So, something you've heard me say if you've watched any of my other videos is you could stop here. You know, at this point, the miniature, it's got color all over. The contrast paints have given it some highlights and some shading. Yeah, I'd paint the base, but you know, you could stop at this point. If you're happy with it, you know, anytime that you look at your miniature and you are happy with how it looks and you feel like it's done, it's done. What matters is whether or not you're happy with the result that you've gotten. In this case, I'm going to go back in with some white and do another layer of highlighting all over the miniature to just kind of goose the contrast a little bit more and give a little bit more dramatic lighting all over the miniature, brighter highlights and darker shadows. So what we've got now here is some thinned white. I almost just said watered down white, but it's not actually watered down because there's no water involved here. What I've got here is some of the Pro-Acryl white plus some of Citadel's LLAMIAN medium. Now, I'm a big fan of contrast medium. I use it a lot. LLAMIAN medium, I'm using it because I've got it, but honestly, you could use basically any paint medium. Golden makes a good one. Vallejo makes some. Yeah, you take your pick. I do prefer using a clear medium instead of water to thin down paints when you're highlighting. I personally find it trickier to do highlights with a watery paint. I think the thickness and viscosity that you get from thinning your paint with a medium just makes it a little bit easier to put that paint and stick that paint where you want it to go. So what we're doing here is an all over highlight of white. Every single color that we've painted so far, we're going in and on the areas that you can kind of see from above here where the, you know, bright Borderlands desert sun would be shining down on Lilith, or the bright fluorescence of the spaceship, or the bright whatever is shining from up above. We are lighting her from above, which means we're going in with a little bit of this thin down white and just placing it on the tops of the wrinkles of her jacket, the upper surfaces of her shoulder pads and her belt. And this is all over. This is every color is getting a little bit of this thin down white highlight. Skin, shirt, pants, everything. Now the white, when you're doing this step, the white should be thinned down enough that you can still see a little bit of the color through it. This is not a totally opaque, hide the color underneath sort of layer. This is a thin enough layer of white that, you know, it looks white. Doesn't look purple, but it is thin enough to still show some of the color. Pay special attention to the hair and the face. You really want to make sure you're bringing the highlights up a little brighter there. But, you know, beyond that, just kind of put it where it looks natural, where you think the light might hit. You generally want to avoid highlighting any undersides of things. You're largely highlighting areas that you can see when looking at the miniature from the front or, you know, from above, straight on. Practice a little bit, you'll quickly get the hang of it. So for the base, we're going to try something a little different. Instead of using a textured surface, which is, you know, normally my go-to for bases, we're going to do a flat painted base. I think this will be a fun little experiment, and I think it will match the Borderlands style pretty well. So kind of as the base for the effect, we're putting down a pretty thick layer of the Pro-Acryl warm gray, and then we're going to get a brush full of the Pro-Acryl light neutral gray. And the goal here is to just kind of mush these two colors together. You call this blending. It is blending. We are blending these two paints together, but I'm looking for something that's a little more natural, a little messier transition from the light gray to the dark gray. You're almost trying to fool the eye into thinking that this flat surface has a subtle kind of concrete industrial texture on it. You can see I'm using a variety of brush strokes. I'm dabbing, I'm swiping, and you just kind of work the paint until it kind of has the look you're going for. I want the front of the base to be a little brighter than the back of the base, and that'll help give the effect that the light is kind of coming from the front of her. And kind of poke at it until you are happy with how it looks. The thicker the paint that's there, the longer time you have to mush it around with your brush. So you put it on pretty thick. You know, this is just a flat base, so you don't have to put it on in one thin coat. I'm putting on pretty good blobs of paint on the front of the base here, and then just using my brush to feather it out. If you've heard people talk about wet blending before, that's basically what I'm doing here, is I'm wet blending in that both paints are still wet, the light gray and the dark gray. Both paints are wet, and I'm blending them together. Now, to me, blending implies a smoother effect than what I'm going for here. I'm looking for something, like I said, that's a little rougher, a little more textured, but doing it with both paints at the same time, that wet on wet, having some light gray and some dark gray, will have the colors mixed together naturally on the base and just give a better effect than if you had done this all dark gray and then put the light gray on top, which you could do by feathering out the edges. And we'll do that a little bit with some rust later on. But play around. If you haven't tried wet blending, this is a flat base is absolutely the easiest, best way to practice. You can see as stuff has started to dry, I'm grabbing a little bit of the light gray, just with the tips of the bristles kind of stippling on some little dots and scratches. We'll put some dark gray on the edge of the base. I think that helps to visualize what the miniature is going to look like when it's finished. And, you know, say again, at this stage, if you're happy with the base and you're happy with how it looks, you can call it done. Those sharp, bright white highlights, they're a look. If you're cool with that style, if you like that style, call it. Pull out the next miniature. That's a dramatic look right now with all over white highlights. Not what I'm shooting for, but I think it's kind of cool. So for this next stage, this is basically the first part of the video all over again. This is literally taking all the same paints that we used before. We got Guilliman Flesh, roughly in the same order. And we're just going to do exactly what we did in the first half of this video. So it is time to super speed through all of this, because if you watch the first part of the video, we're doing all the same thing. So why are we doing this twice? Now, if you can imagine on the miniature, you've got a layer of contrast, followed by a white highlight, followed by another layer of contrast. That means that the areas of the miniature that didn't get the white highlight earlier now are getting a double layer of contrast paint, effectively darkening them while leaving the white highlights that we did in the previous stage to be the color of a single layer of contrast paint. So what this gives us is just a more dramatic gradation between shadows and highlights, while none of the highlights now are the same white that they were previously. We've got light brown highlights on the pans, light gray highlights on the black areas. This really pulls everything together. This is a really, in my mind, easy way to get a good looking miniature relatively quickly. One can certainly spend a lot more time wet blending every color into its shadows and highlights. You can use glazing to get great looking blends on your minis, and those all work. And there's reasons and times to use all those techniques. But when you want to get a miniature done, have it look pretty good, and not spend scads and scads of time on it, I think this technique is a really great value for your time in that you can achieve good looking results without spending too long on any given miniature. Obviously, this video has been edited down. I've snipped out the parts where I took a break or let paint dry. The dog needed to be let outside and whatnot. But start to finish, this miniature was about an hour and a half of time behind the brush. So about an hour and a half of active painting time. So what I've been doing here as I was talking is just adding some little pinpoint highlights of very thinned down white to the kind of corners and edges of the miniature just to make them pop a little bit more. Very light though. So for this next step here, we've got some black, whatever, dealer's choice, whatever black you want. This is a watered down black. I did thin this out with water a little bit because what I'm doing here is going in and painting her eye sockets black. And before I used medium to thin down the paint because I wanted the paint to sit on the raised surfaces of the miniature. But in this case, when I want the paint to flow into the recessed areas of the miniature, water is your friend because the water is going to run downhill. The water is going to run down the tiny little hills in the miniature into the valleys. And that's what we're looking for. Next, we're going to grab a little bit of black and paint her lips black. Not because she's wearing black lipstick, but the goal is to have her with red lips that have a very, very, very thin line of black around the red. And it is much easier to paint the lips black first and then put the red inside the black versus putting a tiny thin line of black around the red. So we'll paint the lips black. She's got that goth look going on right now, but then we'll go back in and add a red layer to make the lips red with a black outline. So what I'm doing here for the eyes with the eye socket all the way black, I'm painting a very thin line of white, just kind of a streak of white across the inside of the black area. What you're going for here when you're done with this step is a miniature that looks like its eyes have rolled up into the back of its head. So there's a black area, a little kind of a black outline surrounding all white eyes. And then what you do is connect the black outline by putting a little dot in the middle of the white. So some people like to paint the whole eye socket black and put 2 dots of white. I think that's harder to get the 2 dots of white lined up than if you put a stripe of white and dot the middle with a pupil. This is hard to see when the miniature is moving around a little bit, but we'll have a picture of the finished miniature at the end so you can see the result. So it's just the tiniest little bit of black in the middle of the eye to kind of chop that strip of white that you painted on in the middle. And that'll leave you with an eye socket that's rimmed with black with 2 white dots on either side of a pupil. And for painting eyes, I think this is the quickest, easiest way to get eyes that are where the 2 sides of the eye, the whites of the eye, are even with each other with a centered pupil. Nothing will ruin a miniature faster than having crazy eyes. So it's worth practicing it. That takes a little bit of practice, and you could just leave the eyes shaded if you wanted to. So here's the red for the lips. I'm using the Pro-Acryl Basic Red, which has nice coverage, which helps for going over the black, and just putting a teeny tiny little streak of red down the middle of the black. The goal is to have just a hair's width of black visible on all sides of the red, kind of like, red lipstick with black lip liner around it. In miniature, that's going to look dramatic, and just use the tip of the brush to hit the corners of the mouth to get a nice little sharp corner there. Since this is going to be a character model, one of the centerpieces of the game, centerpieces of the collection, I'm going to take a little bit more time and do another highlighting and shading stage on her face. So like we did on the rest of the miniature, that's putting in another layer of shading. This time I'm going to darken the lower half of her face. Kind of looks like you're giving her a 5 o'clock shadow, like she hasn't shaved in a while. But that's okay. We're going to bring it back up with white after that. And what this does by darkening the lower half of her face, it'll bring out the brightness of her cheekbones and nose and forehead and kind of put the focus on the eye. So then having done that, we'll bring up with another thin down white highlight, bring up the brightness of her chin and her cheekbones. So on the hair, rather than going back to the Vulpus pink that we used for the first coat, I wanted the shaded areas of her hair to be a little more dramatic while keeping the highlights very light. So I reached for a pot of the Carroburg Crimson. This is one of the Citadel washes, which is even thinner and more transparent still than the contrast paints. I'm just going to darken up the recesses in her hair and while tinting the highlights pink without darkening it too much overall. The Carroburg Crimson also works well as a light eyeshadow. In many of the pictures in many of the Borderlands games, Lilith has some pink eyeshadow. So just by placing a teeny tiny little bit of the Carroburg Crimson wash above her eyes, we can apply a little bit of her signature makeup. The other Citadel washes also can work well for makeup effects, whether or not that's blush or eyeshadow on miniatures that are wearing makeup. The blue wash also works well for a blue eyeshadow, and I think the Carroburg Crimson, it also works well as a blush color. So with that done, we're going to move on to the base. Me working with the Pro-Acryl Orange and the Burnt Sienna. The Burnt Sienna is a great starting point for any rust effects. Throw that on the base. We're going to put a little blob of that and then quickly rinse the paint off the brush and get some water on the brush. And with that wet brush, you can just feather out the edges like so. My brush is dropping bristles there. So blob of paint, nice. It'll stay wet for a minute. Rinse off the brush, grab your brush as it's damp, and then use your wet brush to just circle the edges of that blob of paint. You'll get a nice kind of feathered rust effect there. You can keep spreading out the thin rust to blend it into the rest of the base. Blob of paint. Feather out the edges with a wet brush, like so. Kind of blend it in. And, this is rust. There's no right or wrong way to do it. You're just kind of looking for some kind of natural patchiness. Grab a damp brush, spread it out, and just keep doing that until you're happy with something. If it's a little bit wet there, you see how that's kind of pooling up a little bit? That'll look good when it's dry. You can grab the little bit of burnt sienna and stipple on some little smaller dots and stuff. And then once you're happy with how the darker sienna, kind of dark orange looks, you can grab some bright orange and grab whatever your brightest orange you've got. And just kind of do a little dot, kind of stippling the bright orange into the dark orange. And if you can get it where you've got a little bit of the dark orange still wet on the base, you can use that to kind of naturally blend them together a little bit. So just kind of keep working back and forth. With the rusty effect, you generally want the bright orange to kind of be inside the darker orange. And, we're working on a flat base here. We're not painting the rust in between any particular shapes on the base. We're not working with any texture that's already on the base. So this is a fun opportunity to practice some of your free brushing skills on a very easy, cool effect. We're not painting dragons and griffins and corporate logos on the base here. We're just going to go in for some messy, natural shapes. This is, again, if you're used to just painting within the lines on the miniature, I think this is a fun, kind of fast and loose process to create a natural looking base. So with some of the ATHONIAN CAMOSHADE, which is another one of the washes, not a contrast paint, and blob a little bit of that on there. It'll give it a little bit of, again, kind of a greenish, natural, messy look. Blend those oranges. And while that dries, we're going to grab a little bit of white, again, mixed up with a little bit of medium, because we want this to sit on the surfaces, not in the valleys. And we're going to start on her tattoos. So to start off, I'm not trying to copy exactly the tattoo that she has in the game, but I'm trying to go for the right effect of swirling thick lines on her left arm. I appreciate that she's left-handed, apparently. Always nice to see. So in the game, her tattoos are kind of evenly spaced, relatively thick lines of glowing blue. Now, to get that glowing blue effect, we're starting with white because we're going to do something that's similar to what we've done with the rest of the miniature, which is to start with white, put a thin transparent layer over that, and then highlight it again. So Lilith's tattoos stretch from her left arm kind of down the left side of her neck and chest. So we're going to put a couple little thin white lines to kind of give the impression that her tattoos are stretching under her jacket and onto the front of her torso. So you're just going to go in, touch up those white lines, add some little ticks and dags to give them a little bit more of a tribal look. And once you're happy with those, you do want to wait just a minute and make sure that that white paint is fully dry before moving on to adding the blue, because you don't want the thin, blue contrast paint to wash away any of the white paint. Paint is very waterproof once it's fully dry, but you can sometimes pull up the paint a little bit if you don't let it fully dry. While I've got the white on hand, whenever I have paint on a brush, I always look for an opportunity to use it again. So while I have a little bit of white paint on my brush, I'm going to give her hair just a quick little highlight and bring the tips up to white as they are in some of the Borderlands games. And then also, while we've got white on the palette, I'm going to grab an older, kind of smaller brush, and we're going to do a very light dry brush of some white on the edges of her clothing that are near her glowing tattoos. These areas will get just a little bit of the light blue that we're going to add later and give the effect that the glow of her tattoos is spilling over just a little bit onto her clothing. If you want to learn more about this technique, it's often called object source lighting, or OSL. We're not going to take it to the extreme here at all. I just want to give a little hint that her tattoos are casting a little bit of blue light onto the edges of her left shoulder pad and her jacket, a little tiny bit on her gloves, and adding just a little bit of white right now will provide a spot for the light blue to accent later. And so what we'll do is put the light blue all over everything. The areas of her clothing that the light is spilling onto will stay that light blue, and then we'll go back in and highlight the tattoos again to make it look like it's the tattoos that are actively glowing. So super light dry brush, you're going to go small with that. Let that fully dry before putting on the AETHERMATIC blue, which is one of the Citadel contrast paints. This is a really vibrant blue. It is fairly transparent, but it works great for glowy energy effects. So with this, not glopping it on, this is, again, like applications of the contrast paints previously, this is a pretty thin, even layer. You're going to go short brush strokes, short overlapping brush strokes, give you a nice thin layer without any pooling or glopping on. We're not just putting the AETHERMATIC blue over the white lines that were painted on earlier. The AETHERMATIC blue is going all over her tattooed glowing arm. And what that's going to do is that's going to serve to tint the flesh tones that are in between the tattoo lines a little bit blue too, which, like they're catching a little bit of the blue from the tattoos. And then you can see here we're dabbing on just a little bit of the AETHERMATIC blue onto the white edges of her jacket and her gloves that we did in the previous step, and to represent the blue light that's spilling off of her tattoos and onto her clothing just a little bit. It's really easy to go overboard with this effect. I think that usually when it comes to the object source lighting, the OSL, I think usually less is more. So just kind of go in and carefully put in a little bit of a layer straight out of the bottle. The AETHERMATIC blue, like I said, is very thin. It's better to go in and do a real, nice thin, even coat, let it dry. If there's an area that you want to be a little bit darker, like in the crook of her elbow or the underside of her arm, you can go back in and do a second coat. When you're putting the contrast paint on in these very thin brushed on layers, it dries pretty quickly. Sometimes if you put on a thick layer of contrast paint and try to paint over it before it's fully dry, you'll get an ugly kind of sticky, gummy texture, and you can actually pull away chunks of the paint. When you're painting these nice thin layers, I don't find that happens very often. So that's given the tattoos on her arm and her chest that little bit of glow. Just make sure you've gone in, and you can go in and darken it up a little bit. Just make sure you've hit all the edges. This is also an opportunity to just make sure the layer of blue is even. All of the white lines that you painted earlier are about a similar shade of blue, and you've gotten a little bit of blue on all of the white highlights that you dry brushed on. And then grab a thin brush. You want a really nice, thin, skinny brush for this. We've thinned it out with a little bit of LLAMIAN medium. And now this is actually the trickier part, because previously the lines you drew got a little bit obscured by the blue on top. But what you're going to want to do now is go in and paint some very thin, pure white accents on the glowing lines. When we look at a glowing object, whether or not it's a light bulb or a Christmas light or a glowing tattoo, the source of the light is often so much brighter. The actual light source is so much brighter than the light that it's casting. In miniature, that effect can be recreated by having the actual light source, the actual thing that is glowing, be very, very close to white. Now, because white paint does not fully opaque, it doesn't 100% cover what's underneath it, which is frustrating if you're trying to paint something white, and we've thinned this out with a little bit of medium, you're going to still see a little bit of the blue, just a hint of the blue that was there previously as you paint on these white highlights. It's not going to be a pure chalk white, which is good, but it's going to be pretty bright relative to the rest of the model. And the way our eyes perceive things, it's all about relative brightness. So if these white lines of her tattoos are the very brightest thing on the model, that's going to give the effect you want of them looking bright. What you wouldn't want to do is have these bright white tattoos on her arm and then also have her wearing white pants. That would have the effect of the tattoos looking not nearly as bright. It's hard to get brighter than white paint on a miniature. And the Pro-Acryl bold titanium white is a really nice bright white. So you kind of have to think about what's going to be the brightest part of the mini. That's going to be white, and then everything else stems from there. Go back in, do another layer of the AETHERMATIC blue to add back some of the blue over the bright white highlights. This is very, very thin coat that I'm adding here. Just a hint of it. And I'm also not adding this all over all of that tattoos. I'm giving a little bit of blue into the cracks, a little bit of blue on the underside of the arm. So, like so. So as a finishing touch, we're going to grab the .005 black pen. There's a variety of brands out here. I've been happy with the Zig Millennium. I feel like compared to the Micron pens that I've tried, it's less likely to pull the paint away. It kind of, for whatever reason, I feel like the tip glides over a painted surface a little more easily than the Microns. And here what we're doing is trying to achieve that Borderlands cell shaded effect by painting, well, not painting, by drawing those thin black lines into the cracks and crevices of the model. In the Borderlands art style, those black lines often occur right next to the brightest highlight. They almost serve to kind of accent and accentuate the bright highlights. This is a relatively small miniature with relatively small surfaces. I'm not going to do a ton of these on the model itself. And to some extent, it's not needed because of that black line gloss coat that we started with. It means that a lot of those black lines are already there. So what you're trying to do with the pen step here is add in some black lines, like on the back of the jacket here, places where that gloss wash at the very beginning didn't provide the black lining that you're looking for now. If you look closely at some Borderlands screenshots or art, you'll also notice that in a wide open area, there's often like 2 to 4 little dots that provide a little bit of texture. And you can do that here with this pen, just with a little poke, poke, poke. You can add a couple little dots to some open areas to give it some of that Borderlands texturing. If you're good with a brush and you've got a brush with a nice thin tip, you 100% could do this with a brush, but I think it's easier and faster to do with a pen. And it dries nicely. It can put a matte coat over it without any problem. All right, so now back to the base. With the same pen, we're going to draw on the base, and my idea here, and I've never done a base like this before, so I wasn't 100% sure that it was going to work, but I was happy with how it turned out. So the idea here is I'm going to essentially draw a rough black X with the pen and make this look like it's a poured concrete or like a parking lot, sidewalk, or an industrial concrete floor. You could leave the base as it is if you're happy with it, but I wanted to kind of chop the base up into a couple of sections and add a little bit more depth and detail. So I'm intentionally kind of doing some rough kind of black lines inspired by some of the black lining that I saw on the rock faces in the Borderlands 3. So kind of going in, intentionally adding some little dags and lines. There's no right or wrong way to do this. You can just kind of play around, but it's basically 2 big lines and then adding in some other little cracks and lines as appropriate. And what we're creating here is a little bit of shading on the base to add another layer of depth. Now, I'll be honest, when I was doing this, I thought I had messed up the base. I did not love how this was looking, and I kind of kept adding some more lines and texture to it in an effort to make it look better. And at this point, I didn't love how it looked. I went in and grabbed a thicker marker. I think this is a 0.01. It's double the thickness. This is a Winsor Newton brand. And I wanted to thicken up the main cross on the base. Just wanted to darken that a little bit more with a thicker black line. And like I said, at this stage, I was like, ugh, I was kind of grimacing. I did not love how this was turning out. So I probably should have stopped, but I kept adding, if I just add a little texture over here, maybe this will look good. If I just add a little texture over here, maybe that'll make it not look so bad. Yeah, and then I had the thought, maybe I could put a black line around the edge of the base, but the marker didn't really like that. It doesn't really want to draw with the side of the marker, so that didn't work. So we won't do that. Instead, let's clean up the edge of the base. And still, looking at the base, it just didn't look right. As I kind of painted the edge of the base, thought about why does this look wrong? Well, it looks wrong because it has shading, but it doesn't have any highlighting. Right now, if you look at the base, those black lines add shading to the base, but the base is missing the highlight that would really make the shading pop, that would really tell the story that those are cracks in the pavement. Without a highlight, those cracks, they kind of look like what they are, which is black lines drawn on top of a concrete texture. So with a nice thin brush and a thin down bright neutral gray, I went in and I chose a direction. I kind of thought, all right, the light is kind of shining on her face. If the light is shining on her face, where might the light hit the cracks in the pavement? So I went in with a bright neutral gray, which is the same grade that we used on the base earlier, and highlighted every single black line, imagining that it was a raised surface with light coming from her perspective, kind of upper left. So all the little black lines in the base got a little subtle highlight of light gray next to each black line. You can see here I'm kind of just tracing right next to the black line with that light gray. And that immediately made it pop in a very Borderlands style black line and highlights. So throughout the Borderlands scenery, if you fire up the game and look at some of the scenery, some of the backdrops in the game, it's often the case that there's a bright highlight right next to the darkest shadow. And adding in those light gray highlights next to the black pen lines really sells the story of the concrete textured base being three-dimensional with cracks in it, I think. Tell me what you think in the comments if you have any questions about that or comments on that. This is the first time I've ever just painted a base without adding any texture or plastic guard or wires or anything. It was a fun little project within a project. I would do that again. I'm actually happy with how it turned out. I think there's more you could do there too. You could paint, blood splatters. You could put a little blob of pink on the base. I thought about that, but maybe thought it would distract from her hair. But you could put a little blob of dark pink on the base, like somebody had spit their gum out on the sidewalk. Oil stains, graffiti. There's a lot you could do on a base without adding any texture at all to the base. And as we're finishing up here, just want to thanks again to my friends at Monster Fight Club who provided the sneak previews of these miniatures for me to paint up. I hope you're enjoying the series. We've got more Borderlands miniatures in the queue for some more videos in the future. Appreciate you coming by and watching this longer character painting video today. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions about any of the steps in the video or any of the paints used. I'm always happy to answer questions in the comments and check the comments, see what other people are saying. If you haven't already, big appreciation if you subscribe to the channel. That really helps other people find the videos and helps boost the channel as we're just getting started here. And, the more the merrier. I'm already excited about how vibrant the comments have been and what positive feedback these videos have been receiving. So thank you very much for everyone who's watching the videos and participating in the comments. It's been a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to doing more. So final steps here. You can see we're just back to the painting. And we're going to edge the base with just a little bit. Kind of got a long bristled brush here, as you can see. I'm not painting with the tip of the brush here. I'm going to just take this light gray and with the edge of the bristles, paint the roundover on the base. That same light gray that we used, have been using to highlight the concrete. And while I was chatting about thanks and subscriptions, you can see put a little bit of a stippled texture and some extra texture with the light gray on the concrete, adding that highlight layer to the textures there too. Hitting that little line of light gray on the edge of the base, I think really helps to bring it all together. So thanks again for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Here's Lilith finished up in all her glory with a still photo that shows the detail a little bit better than some of the movement in the video does. You can see her glowing tattoos there. Just a little bit of light being cast on her clothing. This is also a better angle to see how the lips lined in black and the eyes turned out. You can check out some more of the Borderlands painting videos in the playlist link there. And I'll see you on the next Jolly Lark.